Some nights feel heavier than others, like the sky itself is pressing down, urging the world to remember what it's lost. That was the kind of night Rachel found herself hurrying through the drizzle, one hand clutching her coat tighter, the other gripping Trooper's leash. Rain tapped out a jittery rhythm on the old iron lampposts lining the sidewalk outside Spokane's weathered public library, a place haunted by more stories than the books inside could ever hold. She should have gone home. She'd promised herself she would, just a quick walk for Trooper before shutting out the world. But something about the library always pulled her in, a gravity she couldn't name. As she passed the overflowing trash can behind the building, Trooper suddenly froze, body taut as piano wire, every muscle straining. His hackles rose, damp fur bristling. For a split second, Rachel wondered if she'd imagined the change, but then he let out a low, insistent whine, the sound vibrating with urgency. "Come on, Trooper, not tonight." She tried, but he was having none of it. He dug in, claws scratching against wet concrete, dragging her toward the bin. The sickly sweet stench of rotting food and rain-soaked paper hit her hard, but Trooper was relentless. He pawed at the metal, whining louder, desperate, eyes wild and pleading. Rachel's breath clouded in the cold air. She hesitated, the edge of fear scraping across her nerves. She'd learned to trust Trooper's instincts. He was more than a partner. He was her lifeline, the only creature on earth who'd never let her down. Heart hammering, she reached out and flipped the lid. A bloody, torn gray hoodie lay inside, balled up, as if someone had tried to bury it beneath a mess of fast food wrappers and rain-slicked newspapers. The sight hit Rachel like a punch to the gut, all the air leaving her lungs in a rush. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to the red stain crawling across the fabric, the jagged edge of a logo half obscured by mud. Her hand trembled. She hadn't seen that hoodie in months, but she'd know it anywhere. It was from April's case. April. The name alone sent a bolt of regret through Rachel, sharp and cold. She pressed a shaking palm to her mouth, willing herself not to break down right here, surrounded by rain and garbage. Trooper nudged her elbow, resting his muzzle on her arm. His eyes, always so full of fierce intelligence, now brimmed with something ancient. Pain, purpose, a memory too heavy for words. He whimpered again, the sound softer this time, as if reminding her that this moment mattered, that it meant something. Rachel pulled the hoodie free, staring at the blood, the rip across the left sleeve. April had been wearing this the night she vanished, the night Rachel made 1,000 tiny choices she'd never forgive herself for. She'd written off April's fear as teenage melodrama, and she'd paid for it ever since. The case had haunted her dreams, poisoned her waking hours, and now, here in a trash can behind the library, she was staring at the first solid clue she'd seen in over a year. Is this the breakthrough, or just another dead end waiting to break her all over again? Thunder rumbled overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, a reminder that the world kept spinning, indifferent to her pain. Rachel stood frozen, soaked to the bone, hoodie clutched in her hands, wrestling with the weight of her own conscience. She could walk away. Nobody knew she was here. The department had officially moved on. New cases, new priorities, a gentle nudge for Rachel to take care of herself. But how could she, knowing this clue had surfaced, knowing April's mother still called once a month, voice breaking, hope dying a little more with every year? Trooper whined, breaking the silence. Rachel looked down at him, saw the unwavering trust in his eyes. In that moment, she made her decision. Not for the department, not for the brass who'd love her to drop it, but for April and for herself. She bagged the hoodie, ignoring the rain running down her neck, and dialed evidence. Her hands shook as she relayed the location, her voice a little too loud, too tight. "I need a tech unit. Now. This is connected to April Henry's disappearance. Yes, I'm sure." She glanced back at Trooper, whose tail wagged just once, a single, silent cheer of solidarity. For a moment, the library's shadow seemed to lean in closer, listening. Rachel felt the weight of the night, the cold, the fear, but also the electric surge of possibility. She knew this road would be brutal, full of old wounds and new dangers, but as Trooper pressed close, she understood the choice was no choice at all. She would see this through. For April, for Trooper, for every promise she'd ever broken and every one she still hoped to keep. And as the rain fell harder, washing away the night's secrets, Rachel and Trooper stood together, braced for whatever waited in the dark. Sleep was always a battle for Rachel, but that night it was unwinnable. She sat alone at her kitchen table, coffee growing cold beside a mountain of files. April's folder lay open, the edges worn from endless review, dog toys scattered on the floor, a strange mix of duty and ordinary life that only made the pain sharper. Trooper was never far from her side, his body curled at her feet, eyes flickering between rest and worry. He seemed to sense her turmoil, the way old dogs do. Every restless sigh, every twitch of her hands as she sifted through photographs and typed up notes was mirrored in the way he shifted, pressed closer, trying to offer comfort she couldn't quite accept. The house was silent except for the humming refrigerator and the distant patter of rain on the roof. Rachel's mind spun back to that night a year ago, the night April disappeared. She could see it as clearly as if it were playing out on an old film reel. April sitting across from her, eyes wide and frightened, voice trembling as she confessed, "I think someone's following me." Rachel had smiled, tried to reassure her, chalked it up to teenage nerves. God, how she'd regretted that smile. Now, every time she looked at April's photo, a shy smile, hair tied back, hoodie zipped up, she felt a fresh wave of guilt. What if she'd believed her? What if she'd done more? Trooper whined softly, breaking the cycle of regret. He lifted his head, amber eyes locking with Rachel's. "Yeah, buddy," she murmured, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "I know. I'm working on it." But even as she tried to reassure herself, she knew something was different now. The hoodie in the trash wasn't a coincidence, and Trooper's instincts were screaming for attention. She shuffled through the case files, pulling out old reports, witness statements, patrol logs, everything that might connect. Her living room became a war zone of paperwork, Trooper weaving through piles of notes and evidence bags, never more than a few feet away. The sky outside slowly shifted from black to gray as dawn crept over Spokane. Rachel was bone-tired, nerves frayed, but the adrenaline wouldn't let her rest. She filled a thermos with coffee, clipped Trooper's leash, and headed out into the damp morning. The park behind the library was deserted, mist hanging low over the grass, the silence interrupted only by birds and the distant sound of a garbage truck making its rounds. Trooper's nose was to the ground immediately, his body tense with focus. Rachel tried to steer him back toward the trash can, but he tugged insistently away, pulling her along the edge of the park toward a dense patch of woods. The sense of anticipation in the air was electric. Every snap of a twig or rustle in the underbrush made Rachel's heart race. They reached the bushes, dew still clinging to the leaves. Trooper barked, digging furiously at a spot beneath a low-hanging branch. Rachel crouched beside him, pushing aside dirt and debris until her fingers closed around something rough and scorched. A partially burned glove, the fingertips charred, but the fabric otherwise intact. Rachel stared at the glove, a cold shiver running down her spine. This wasn't here before, she was sure of it. The glove was new, the burn marks recent. She pulled out a bag, sealed it, and marked the location on her phone. Trooper whined again, nudging her leg, urging her to keep going. "Easy, boy," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "We'll figure this out." She scanned the woods for anything else, scraps of fabric, broken branches, footprints, but the glove was all they found. Back at her car, Rachel laid the glove beside the hoodie, her mind racing. Who had worn it? Why burn it and leave it so close to the original clue? Was someone trying to send a message or cover their tracks? For the first time in months, she felt a flicker of something beyond guilt. It wasn't quite hope, but it was close. If the clues were surfacing now, after all this time, maybe the case wasn't dead after all. Maybe April's story was still unfinished, waiting for Rachel to be brave enough to keep pushing. She knew the department wouldn't like her chasing this. Protocol was clear, the case technically closed, resources needed elsewhere. But Trooper's faith in her was unwavering, and Rachel couldn't ignore her own conscience. She stared at his graying muzzle, the scars beneath his fur from years on the job, and found a renewed sense of determination. That afternoon, Rachel sat in her living room, a fresh stack of files in front of her, the burned glove and bloody hoodie laid out like relics. She picked up her phone, hesitating only a moment before dialing the forensics lab, her voice steady, insistent. "I have new evidence connected to the April Henry case. I need it processed immediately. No, I can't go through channels. Just trust me." As the day faded, Rachel watched Trooper circle his bed, then flop down with a heavy sigh. She knew what her next step had to be. She would follow Trooper's instincts wherever they led, even if it meant risking her badge, her career, or the fragile peace she'd fought so hard to build. Because this time she wasn't just chasing a ghost. She was fighting to keep a promise. And she wouldn't let April down again. By the time evening painted the city in shades of bruised purple, Rachel was running on fumes. The adrenaline that had pushed her through the day gave way to a heavy, familiar ache. She sat at her dining table, the room bathed in the low gold of a single lamp. The cold case files were spread before her, April's folder open like an accusation she could never escape. The world outside was silent, except for the occasional rush of passing cars, their headlights flickering through rain-streaked windows. Rachel traced her finger down the timeline of April's last day, each note, each timestamp a wound that had never fully healed. Sometimes it felt like April's memory was the only thing keeping Rachel upright, and other times, like a stone tied to her ankles. Her phone buzzed with messages she ignored. Colleagues checking in, her sister reminding her to eat. The department sending another, "Please update your case log." She shoved the phone aside, burying herself deeper in the details. A photo of April, caught laughing on her last birthday, stared up at her. Rachel felt her chest tighten. How many nights had she sat right here clutching that picture, wishing for just one more chance to do things differently? Trooper limped into the room, his joints stiff with age but his eyes bright, unyielding. He flopped down with a grunt at Rachel's feet, tail thumping once on the hardwood. She glanced at him, a half-smile tugging at her mouth despite everything. "You know you don't have to babysit me," she murmured. Trooper's eyes perked up, as if in response, and he nudged her ankle with his nose. Sometimes Rachel talked to him like he could answer. Maybe in a way he did. His presence a kind of silent communication, a reassurance she was never truly alone. She reached down, rubbing the patch of white fur on his chest. "You remember that night, don't you?" she whispered. The sirens, the screaming. I bet you still hear it sometimes too. Trooper's tail thumped again, softer this time, eyes never leaving her face. She leaned back in her chair, exhaustion crashing in. The guilt gnawed at her, sharp and relentless. She'd replayed the night April vanished 1,000 times, the way April's voice quavered, how Rachel had dismissed her fear, convinced herself it was just another teenager's anxiety. In the morning, when April was gone, everything in Rachel's life had tilted. Nothing had been the same since. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the old storm windows. Rachel let her gaze drift, lost in memory, until a detail in one of her notes snagged her attention. A name almost forgotten. Leroy Sanchez. He'd worked at the Army surplus store downtown, said something about a kid buying a gray hoodie. Back then, it hadn't seemed important. Now, with the bloody hoodie found behind the library, Rachel wondered what she'd missed. She pulled up the old interview transcript. Yeah, I remember a girl, real quiet, bought a gray hoodie, said it was for a school project. She wasn't alone. There was a guy with her, tall, kept his hood up, looked nervous. Rachel's pulse picked up. Had she written this off as coincidence? Or had she just been too exhausted to see the link? She grabbed her notepad, jotting down Leroy's description, her mind sparking with new possibilities. April hadn't been alone that night. Someone had been with her, a detail that might shift everything. Trooper stirred, sniffing the air, his old body tensing. Rachel glanced at the clock. Midnight. She stood, joints stiff, and wandered into the kitchen, grabbing a water bottle for herself and filling Trooper's bowl. He lapped noisily, then pressed his head against her leg, eyes closing in contentment. You never gave up on me, huh? She said quietly. Not even when I deserved it. The room felt heavier with the admission. Trooper had been her partner for almost a decade. Rescues, chases, dark nights when hope seemed like a joke. He'd slowed down lately, arthritis creeping into his bones, but he refused to stop working. Just like her, she supposed. The loneliness pressed in, sharp around the edges. Rachel let herself sit with it for a while, feeling the weight of every mistake, every missed clue. She stared at her reflection in the kitchen window, haunted eyes staring back. How much longer could she do this? How many more ghosts could she chase before she disappeared into the fog herself? But Trooper nudged her again, and she remembered why she couldn't quit. He was old, yes, but he was loyal to the end, his presence a silent command. Up going. She shuffled back to the table, pulled out the list of local surplus shops, and circled Leroy's store. She'd visit in the morning, ask more questions, look for surveillance footage. Maybe this time, she'd find something everyone else had missed. She glanced down at Trooper, curled up and snoring softly. His breathing was slow, steady, a lullaby in a house full of ghosts. Rachel felt a bittersweet ache. He wouldn't be with her forever, but as long as he was, she'd keep pushing, keep digging, no matter how painful the truth might be. Tomorrow, she'd chase the lead. Tonight, she let herself rest, one hand on Trooper's back, heart a little lighter for the first time in months. Some ghosts, it seemed, weren't meant to be buried. Not yet. Dawn broke slow and cold over Spokane, draping the city in a thin gray mist that softened every edge. Rachel stood by her living room window, coffee mug pressed between both hands for warmth, eyes fixed on the distant shimmer of the river. Trooper lay at her feet, his breathing steady, muzzle flecked with gray, but eyes still sharp with purpose. The world outside was hushed, just the faint cry of early birds, the rustle of wind in the cottonwoods, the city not quite awake. Rachel let her gaze drift to the old police medal hanging on the wall. She reached up, tracing the cool metal with her fingers, memory flooding her. The first big bust with Trooper at her side, adrenaline bright as lightning, the wild, grateful laughter when they brought a missing child home alive. Back then, she'd believed in happy endings. Now she understood that some stories twisted on and on, the wounds never fully closing. She sipped her coffee and let herself remember her own childhood, the silent dinners after her father left, her mother's brittle smile, the loneliness that never seemed to fade. It was that same emptiness that drew her to police work, a hope that by helping others, she could fill in the spaces her own life left blank. Trooper's loyalty, his unwavering companionship, felt like the only constant she'd ever had. The badge, the medal, the rows of case files. Rachel understood now that none of those could replace what was missing. Only the connection she'd built with Trooper, the trust that ran deeper than words, truly anchored her. By the time she clipped Trooper's leash and stepped out into the morning, the mist was starting to thin. They walked together along the river's edge, each step slow and deliberate. Trooper's gait was stiff, but he pushed forward, nose twitching, tracking scents only he could decipher. Rachel watched him, her heart aching with affection and worry. He was aging, slowing, but his spirit hadn't faded. They stopped beneath a cottonwood, dew sparkling on the grass. Rachel knelt beside Trooper, fingers buried in his thick fur. "You ready to work?" she asked softly. Trooper thumped his tail in answer. Her mind was already spinning through the next steps of the investigation. The Army surplus store, Leroy's place, might be the break she needed. The burned glove, the bloody hoodie, April's face haunting every waking moment. There was a momentum now, something alive in the case, and Rachel felt both dread and hope twisting together inside her chest. When they reached the surplus shop, the bell over the door jangled sharp in the morning quiet. Leroy, a burly man with a salt and pepper beard, looked up from behind the counter. His eyes widened a fraction when he saw Rachel, then flicked down to Trooper. "Officer Maddox," Leroy said, nodding. "Didn't expect to see you this early." Rachel tried for a smile, but it didn't quite land. "Sorry for the trouble, Leroy. I need to ask about a purchase. Gray hoodies about a year ago. Do you remember selling a batch to anyone unusual?" Leroy scratched his jaw, thinking. "We move a lot of hoodies, but there was a guy, Evan Cole. Bought a dozen, cash. Tall, nervous type, kept his head down. Didn't say much. Seemed in a hurry." Rachel jotted down the name. "Evan Cole. Do you have any security footage from that week?" "Let me check," Leroy replied, disappearing into the back. Trooper tugged on his leash, snuffling around a rack of jackets. Rachel watched him, her pulse racing. She crouched and let him sniff her hand, eyes searching his face for answers. "What are you thinking, old man?" she whispered. Leroy returned with a USB stick, holding it out. "Here's a copy from the week in question. If you find anything, let me know. I hate thinking I might have helped someone do something bad." Rachel pocketed the stick and thanked him. As she turned to leave, Trooper whined and pawed at a display near the door. Rachel knelt, brushing aside some jackets. Underneath, something glinted. A single dog tag, engraved with the name April H. Her breath caught. Was it possible April had been here, with someone else, before she vanished? She took the tag, heart pounding. Every clue brought more questions, but also a sense of nearness, like she was circling the truth at last. Back at her office, Rachel plugged in the footage, scanning frame by frame. There, Evan Cole, face shadowed by a ball cap, stacking gray hoodies on the counter. But he wasn't alone. A slighter figure, barely visible, stood in the corner. April, unmistakable in her nervous posture. Rachel's heart thudded as she watched Evan pass a wad of cash, glance over his shoulder, then hurry out, April trailing behind. A lead, a new direction. Rachel's head spun with possibility. She ran the name Evan Cole through the department database, finding a string of petty offenses. Shoplifting, trespassing, but nothing violent. Still, something about his connection to April, the way he avoided the cameras, set off every alarm in Rachel's mind. She stared at Trooper, who had settled at her feet, eyes following every move. He was more than just a partner. He was the steady beat beneath the chaos, the reminder that she wasn't alone, not even in her darkest moments. Rachel pressed her fingers to the old service medal on her desk, a silent promise to herself and to April's memory. She would see this through, no matter where it led. The world outside was waking up, but inside Rachel's office, time seemed to freeze. She felt the full weight of memory pressing down, every failure, every missed clue, every scrap of hope. But with Trooper by her side, and the first real lead in months clutched in her hand, she was ready to face whatever came next. For Rachel, the world seemed split into two kinds of nights: those when the past felt like a distant echo, and those when it came barreling back, heavy and relentless. This night was the second kind, charged with the sharp electricity of possibility and fear. The case files littered her coffee table, evidence bags glinting in the lamplight. Outside, the wind howled, rattling her windows, and somewhere in the dark, a siren wailed, as if echoing the turmoil inside her chest. Rachel leaned over her computer, cross-referencing Evan Cole's name with old police reports. Her brow furrowed in concentration. Her mind was a hive of connections: Hoodie's, April's disappearance, the burned glove, Evan's nervousness in the footage. It was a fragile web, but with every click, every note, it grew stronger. Trooper lay at her feet, chin on his paws, tail thumping whenever Rachel muttered to herself. He'd been her sounding board for years, a silent partner in every late-night obsession. She found what she was looking for: a traffic report from the night April vanished. Witnesses had spotted a red pickup truck circling the block near the library. The license plate matched a vehicle registered to Evan Cole. Rachel's breath caught. She jotted the details, her hand steady despite the adrenaline flooding her veins. Doubt slithered in, cold and insistent. What if she was wrong? What if Evan was just a scared kid in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or what if she'd missed something bigger, something darker? The fear twisted inside her, but she couldn't turn back. Not now. She checked her watch. Late, but not too late for a visit. She clipped Trooper's leash and grabbed her jacket, feeling the familiar surge of anxiety that came before every confrontation. As she drove across the city, her headlights carved tunnels through the mist, every shadow seeming to move, every alleyway a possible hiding place for the truth. Evan's house was a squat, peeling blue rental on a quiet street. Rachel parked down the block, muscles tensed. Trooper paced in the back seat, ears pricked. Rachel ran a hand over his head. "Stay sharp, buddy." She walked up the cracked path, knocked once, twice. The porch light flicked on. Evan opened the door, eyes wide and bloodshot. He looked smaller in person. Thin, shoulders hunched, dark hair unkempt. Behind him, the faint glow of a television flickered. "Officer Maddox?" His voice was a whisper, barely audible over the barking of a neighbor's dog. "It's late. What's this about?" Rachel fixed him with a steady gaze. "I need to ask you some questions about April Henry. You remember her?" Evan's lips parted, then closed. He glanced over his shoulder. I already told the cops everything last year. Rachel pushed gently, stepping inside. Trooper followed, nose to the ground, body low and tense. We found new evidence. I just need to clear up a few things. Mind if we talk in here? Evan nodded, leading her to a cramped living room. The place was cluttered. Empty pizza boxes, overflowing ashtrays, a muddy pair of boots by the back door. Trooper moved methodically, sniffing around the edges, then circling the room. Rachel kept one eye on Evan, the other on her partner. She started soft. You bought a bunch of gray hoodies from Leroy's store last year. Why? Evan fidgeted, picking at a thread on his sleeve. I needed them for work. Construction job. I gave them to the crew. He didn't meet her eyes. Rachel's gaze drifted to the back door, where Trooper had stopped. The old dog's hackles rose, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Rachel moved to investigate. In the corner, leaning against the wall, was a mud-stained shovel. The sight sent a chill up her spine. Where were you the night April disappeared? Rachel's tone was sharper now, the room suddenly colder. Evan swallowed hard. At home, watching TV. My roommate was here, he'll tell you. Your roommate isn't listed on the lease, Rachel said quietly. Nobody saw you between 10 and midnight. Evan's hands shook. He shot a glance toward the back door. Look, I don't know what you want. I didn't do anything, Trooper barked, insistent and loud. Rachel took a step closer, fixing Evan with a stare. That shovel, why is it covered in mud? And where were you driving your truck that night? Evan's composure cracked. He shrank into the couch, voice trembling. I went out for smokes. That's it, I swear. Rachel's instincts screamed at her. There was more to this. But Evan wasn't going to confess. Not now, not without proof. She took a steadying breath. We'll be in touch, Evan. Don't leave town. She left, Trooper trotting at her side, the tension between them thick as the night air. Outside, Rachel leaned against her car, heart pounding. She stared up at the empty windows, trying to piece together what she'd missed. Evan was hiding something. The mud-stained shovel, the red truck, his fear. They all pointed to a secret buried deeper than she'd thought. But was Evan acting alone? Or was someone else pulling the strings? Rachel drove home in silence, the city sliding past in a blur. Her mind whirled with possibilities. Every shadow outside her window another unanswered question. She knew she was pushing her luck. Department brass wouldn't be happy she was chasing ghosts, especially not like this. But she couldn't stop. Not until she had the truth. Back at her apartment, she dropped to the floor, wrapping Trooper in a hug, burying her face in his fur. We're close, boy. I can feel it. Just a little further. Trooper licked her hand, tail thumping, a quiet vote of confidence. As Rachel drifted to sleep, the image of the mud-stained shovel haunted her dreams, a silent promise that the darkest secrets always find a way to the surface. The next morning dawned cold and metallic, the sun shrouded behind a veil of cloud. Rachel barely noticed. She was already awake, staring at the kitchen wall while her coffee sat untouched. Her thoughts were a jumble of clues, suspicions, and dread. The bloodied hoodie had gone to the lab for a rush analysis. She checked her phone every few minutes, heart racing with every notification, only to be disappointed by mundane texts from her sister or routine updates from the department. Time crawled by, thick with anticipation. Trooper paced the hallway, restless. He'd sensed her anxiety since dawn, refusing his breakfast, hovering at her heel every time she crossed the room. Rachel knelt and pressed her forehead to his, breathing in the comfort of his familiar scent. We're close, boy. I know it. We just need a break. Around noon, her phone finally rang. She fumbled to answer, voice trembling. Maddox. It was the forensic tech. We confirmed it. The blood on the hoodie matches April Henry's. It's hers, no doubt. Rachel closed her eyes, every muscle in her body tensing. Hope and sorrow crashed together, as if she'd been thrown into icy water. She murmured her thanks, hung up, and sat in stunned silence. She'd wanted answers, needed them desperately. But the confirmation felt like a sentence as much as a breakthrough. The reality of April's fate had never felt so close. The hardest part came next, telling April's mother. Rachel made the call, her hands shaking. The woman's sobs were muffled, but Rachel could hear the pain, could feel it vibrating through the line. Thank you for not giving up, April's mother whispered, voice raw with a decade's worth of grief. Thank you for remembering my girl. Rachel promised she wouldn't stop, but it sounded hollow, even to her own ears. That afternoon, Rachel took Trooper back to the woods where they'd found the burned glove. The sky was iron gray, and the air tasted like impending rain. Trooper's steps were careful but determined, nose to the damp earth, body vibrating with purpose. Rachel followed, boots squelching in the mud, heart thudding in her chest. Suddenly, Trooper stopped short, pawing furiously at a patch of soft ground near an old tree. Rachel dropped to her knees, scraping aside leaves and dirt. Her fingers brushed something hard, metal, cold and rust-stained. She dug deeper, her breath coming fast, and unearthed a small tin box, battered but intact. Rachel pried it open. Inside, nestled among clumps of mud, was April's silver bracelet, the one she'd worn every day, engraved with tiny daisies. Rachel's breath caught. Next to it was a torn, faded photograph. April, grinning with her arm around a tall figure whose face had been ripped away, and beneath that, a slip of paper, its edges curled and words scrawled in shaky handwriting. You'll never find her. Stop digging. A chill ran down Rachel's spine. She swallowed, hands shaking as she laid the evidence out on her jacket. The bracelet was irrefutable, the photo a heartbreak, the note a threat. Someone had wanted to bury the truth as deeply as they could. Trooper whined, pressing his head against her arm. She hugged him tightly, fighting tears. Good boy. You always know where to look, don't you? That night, she returned home and logged everything. Photos, GPS coordinates, the contents of the box. Her report meticulous and detailed. She barely slept, mind replaying every moment with April's mother, every threat left unsaid in that note. She watched old footage from the surplus store again, pausing on Evan's nervous glances and the way he seemed to shrink whenever the cameras turned his way. By midnight, Rachel made a decision. She would watch Evan closely. There was something in his fear, in his desperate attempts to avoid attention, that suggested he knew more than he'd ever admitted. Maybe he hadn't acted alone. Maybe someone else had forced him to cover for them. The next evening, Rachel sat parked across from Evan's place, rain streaking the windshield. She sipped lukewarm coffee, eyes fixed on his battered red pickup. Hours ticked by, Trooper snoring in the back seat. But Rachel was patient. She'd learned how to wait in the darkness. Just past midnight, Evan emerged from the house, shoulders hunched, glancing nervously up and down the street. He loaded something heavy into the bed of his truck. Bags, a shovel, something wrapped in plastic. Rachel's pulse quickened. What was he doing? Was he about to run, or was he cleaning up a mess someone else had left behind? She let him drive off, following at a distance, headlights off, every sense heightened. Trooper was awake now, nose pressed to the glass, body tensed with anticipation. Evan drove out of town, turning down a service road that led into the woods. He parked, headlights flicking off. Rachel pulled over, heart hammering, hands tight on the steering wheel. She watched through binoculars as Evan unloaded the truck, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone, anyone, to appear from the darkness. Rachel held her breath. If he was guilty, tonight he'd reveal it. If he was covering for someone else, she had to see it through. Trooper whined softly, a low warning in his throat. Rachel squeezed his collar, her determination crystallizing. "We're not letting him go this time, old friend." As the wind whipped through the trees and rain began to fall, Rachel and Trooper watched the shadows, waiting for the truth to come crawling out of the dark. Rachel had grown used to the nervous energy that clung to her skin during stakeouts, but this night was different. It was as if every nerve in her body was vibrating with the knowledge that everything could change in an instant. Rain hammered the roof of her car as she followed Evan's red pickup down the abandoned highway, headlights off, each mile pulling them deeper into the shadows outside Spokane. Trooper was alert, nose pressed against the glass, body trembling with anticipation. Rachel watched him out of the corner of her eye, reminded yet again how many years they'd weathered together. He was old, sure, slowed by age and pain, but tonight he seemed possessed by something fierce and urgent, like he knew they were racing the clock. The highway gave way to gravel, then to a twisting dirt road flanked by towering pines. Rachel kept her distance, barely daring to breathe. At the end of the road, a chain-link fence came into view, half collapsed, surrounding what had once been a quarry. Evan's brake lights glowed red in the darkness as he rolled through the gap, headlights vanishing as he killed the engine. Rachel parked far back and cut her own lights. The silence was thick, broken only by the steady drum of rain and Trooper's low whine. She clipped on Trooper's harness, checked her flashlight, and slipped from the car, moving low and quick through the wet underbrush. They crept to the edge of the quarry, Rachel's boots sinking into mud. She saw Evan moving quickly, nervous, constantly looking over his shoulder. He hauled a duffel bag from the bed of his truck, set it down by a half-collapsed shed, and fumbled with the lock. Rachel's pulse thudded in her ears as she motioned for Trooper to stay close. Lightning flashed, illuminating the scene for a split second. The shed, the glint of metal shovels, a stack of trash bags by the wall. Rachel squinted, making out shapes, boots caked with dried mud, bottles of bleach, the unmistakable outline of a bloody work glove. Every detail lined up with the evidence from April's case. Rachel moved in, silent as a ghost, her gun drawn but held low. As she drew closer, a twig snapped underfoot. Evan's head whipped around. His eyes met Rachel's, wide and terrified. "Stop!" she called, her voice cutting through the downpour. "Spokane PD! Evan, don't run!" But panic had already taken over. Evan bolted, tripping over a pile of scrap metal, duffel bag forgotten in the mud. He sprinted toward the quarry's far edge. Rachel broke into a run, Trooper surging ahead of her, barking with a deep, guttural force she hadn't heard in years. "Trooper, block him!" Rachel shouted. The old dog moved with a speed that defied his age, launching himself across the muddy ground. He cut off Evan's escape, barking and snapping until Evan stumbled backward, hands raised in surrender. Evan was sobbing, chest heaving. Rain streaked his face, mingling with tears and sweat. Rachel skidded to a halt, breath ragged, gun still trained on him. "Don't move, Evan! It's over!" Evan crumpled to his knees, sobbing, words tumbling out between gasps. I can't. He said he'd kill me. I didn't do it. Please, I didn't kill her." Rachel felt a jolt of confusion and dread. She lowered her gun, but kept it ready. "Who, Evan? Who are you talking about?" Evan shook his head, clutching his chest. Tyrell Madsen." He made me help. He said he'd hurt my family if I didn't, if I told anyone. Trooper whined and pressed against Rachel's leg, seeking comfort. She crouched beside Evan, searching his face for any hint of deception. But all she saw was fear. Raw, broken, unmistakably real. "Why now?" Rachel demanded, voice shaking. "Why come out here tonight?" Evan stared at the ground. "He called me. Said he was coming for me if I talked. I was trying to clean up, get rid of everything. But I couldn't do it. I can't. I'm so tired." Rachel's mind spun. Tyrell Madsen, a name that had floated in the periphery of the investigation, never sticking, always just out of reach. Could he really be the monster hiding in plain sight? She handcuffed Evan, reading him his rights with numb precision. The rain had let up, but Rachel's heart still hammered as if thunder threatened overhead. She led Evan back to the car, Trooper limping behind her, breath coming hard but eyes bright with triumph. Back at the station, Rachel booked Evan, then sat across from him in the harsh light of the interrogation room. He spilled everything. How Tyrell had lured April, how he'd been forced to watch, to clean up, to bury the evidence, how fear had kept him silent, night after night, until Rachel's persistence and Trooper's unrelenting nose brought everything bubbling to the surface. As the dawn broke gray and unsteady, Rachel stared out her office window, the weight of the truth settling in. The case had blown wide open, a new suspect, new evidence, a new chase to begin. Trooper lay at her feet, spent but proud, his muzzle resting on Rachel's shoe. She reached down, rubbing his ear, gratitude and love swelling inside her. He had given everything, pushed past his limits, and once again brought her to the edge of justice. They weren't finished yet. The real monster was still out there. But for the first time, Rachel felt the certainty that they would bring this nightmare to an end, together. The sky was gunmetal gray when Rachel stepped outside the police station, the early morning chill clinging to her skin. She'd barely slept, her mind replaying every word of Evan's confession, every crack in his voice as he finally told the truth. Trooper followed at her heel, old but unyielding, nose twitching at the scent of coming rain. Inside her office, the phone rang. The voice on the other end was distorted, gravelly, yet unmistakably real. "Rachel Maddox," it hissed. "Stop digging. I know where you live. If you keep chasing ghosts, you and that mutt are next." The line went dead, leaving nothing but a hollow dial tone and the sound of Rachel's heart pounding in her chest. Rachel stared at the receiver, her hands trembling. Tyrell Madsen, the real monster. She'd seen his name before, scattered in background checks, whispered in witness statements, a shadow moving behind other people's crimes. He had always felt slippery, uncatchable. Now he was no longer hiding in the shadows. Now he was hunting her. For a moment, Rachel felt the old, familiar fear rising, sharp and cold, threatening to pull her under. She thought of April, of the promise she'd made to that grieving mother, and of Trooper, whose whole body seemed to vibrate with alertness. She reached down, ruffling his fur, drawing strength from his presence. "We're not backing down, buddy," she whispered. "Not now." She pulled up Tyrell's file. Minor arrests, never enough to stick. A history of intimidation and control. No family to lean on, no steady job. Just a string of addresses and a reputation for violence. Rachel traced his most recent contacts, finding a lead. A cousin named Malik who lived on the outskirts of town. It was a thin thread, but it was something to follow. She called for backup, but the department was thin tonight. A shooting on the west side, a pile-up on I-90. "We'll send a unit as soon as we can," dispatch said. "Be careful, Rachel." But Rachel couldn't wait. The clock was ticking. She clipped on Trooper's harness, loaded her weapon, and drove out into the deepening dusk. The neighborhood around Malik's house was quiet, the kind of silence that feels unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. She parked half a block away, scanning the shadows. The air was heavy with the scent of wet earth, and something sharper: fear. Trooper whined, pawing at the door. "Easy, boy," Rachel murmured. "We'll take it slow." They crept toward the house, Rachel's flashlight cutting through the gloom. The front door hung open, swinging gently on its hinges. Inside, the place was a mess. Drawers pulled out, furniture overturned, as if someone had been searching for something or someone. Trooper moved ahead, sniffing, tail rigid. From the back of the house, Rachel heard footsteps, quick, frantic. She pressed herself against the wall, gun drawn. Trooper barked once, sharp and commanding. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was only the rain beating against the roof, the steady thud of her own heart. Then a figure burst from the back door, sprinting toward the woods behind the house. "Tyrell!" Rachel shouted, surging forward, Trooper at her side. Tyrell was big, fast, but desperation made him sloppy. He crashed through the undergrowth, snapping branches, stumbling in the mud. Rachel followed, breath burning in her lungs, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly. "Police, stop!" she yelled. But Tyrell just ran harder, glancing back with wild, panicked eyes. They plunged deeper into the woods, the world shrinking to a tunnel of movement, noise, and fear. Trooper lunged ahead, barking, forcing Tyrell to swerve. Suddenly, Tyrell twisted, brandishing a knife that caught the flashlight's glow. Rachel's blood went cold. "Get back!" Tyrell roared, voice cracking with rage. "I'm not going back! You hear me?" For a split second, Rachel hesitated. Then Trooper, fearless, lunged at Tyrell's arm. The blade sliced through the air, but Trooper's jaws found their mark, clamping down with the last reserves of his old strength. Tyrell howled, twisting free, the knife falling into the mud. Rachel tackled him, adrenaline making her strong, every ounce of guilt and fury lending her power. She wrestled Tyrell to the ground, pinning his arms as Trooper held his legs, both of them refusing to give an inch. "It's over!" she shouted, cuffs snapping around his wrists. For a moment, the woods were silent except for Tyrell's heavy breathing and Rachel's pounding heart. Trooper limped to her side, tongue lolling, eyes bright with triumph and exhaustion. Rachel radioed for backup, voice steady but breathless. "Suspect in custody. Repeat, Tyrell Madsen in custody. Send an ambulance for a dog bite and minor injuries." She sank to the ground, knees in the mud, letting herself feel the weight of the moment. Back at the station, Tyrell broke under questioning. The whole ugly story spilled out. How he'd stalked April, how Evan had been forced to help him, how he'd buried evidence and threatened anyone who came close to the truth. Evan's terror had been real, April's suffering unbearable. Rachel listened in silence, a cold fury settling over her. She called April's mother, voice cracking as she delivered the news. There were no words big enough for the relief and sorrow that washed through the phone line. For the first time in years, Rachel felt the case closing, not just on paper, but in her heart. That night, as the rain finally stopped and a thin silver moon rose above the city, Rachel sat on her porch with Trooper at her side. She wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his fur. "We did it, old friend," she whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. "We did it." Trooper pressed closer, his warmth a silent answer in the dark. In the days that followed Tyrell's arrest, a heavy quiet settled over Spokane. The city, for so long haunted by April's disappearance, now felt strangely subdued, like everyone was waiting for something to shift, to mark the difference between before and after. For Rachel, the adrenaline had faded, replaced by an unfamiliar emptiness. The case that had defined her, that had stalked her every waking thought and haunted her sleep, was suddenly over. She found herself alone in her living room most nights, the weight of silence pressing down like a thick blanket. The coffee table was littered with old files, evidence bags, and empty mugs. April's photo, once the centerpiece of her obsession, now sat propped against a stack of paperwork, gazing out with a quiet, knowing smile. The evening light slanted through the blinds, painting stripes across the room, golden and fleeting. Trooper lay by her side, his head resting on her foot, body weary from the weeks of relentless work. He watched her with those deep, soulful eyes that seemed to know every secret, every wound. Rachel reached down, fingers ruffling his fur, drawing comfort from the steady rise and fall of his breath. She tried to put the pieces back together, her career, her sense of self, her belief in justice. She filled out endless reports, sat through debriefings with brass, who congratulated her but also scolded her for going off protocol. She nodded politely, but inside she felt detached, as if she were floating just outside her own life. The truth was, closure didn't feel like she'd imagined. For years, she'd built her identity around the failure to solve April's case, around the guilt that had driven her through late nights and personal sacrifices. She had believed that the truth would set her free, that catching the monster would bring relief, maybe even joy. Instead, it brought something quieter and more complicated, a heavy, aching peace. One evening, April's mother visited her apartment. They sat in silence for a long time, the air filled with things that didn't need saying. Finally, April's mother reached across the table and took Rachel's hand. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse but sure. "Not for solving it, though I'm grateful, but for not letting the world forget her. You remembered her when no one else did." Rachel's throat tightened. She squeezed the woman's hand, blinking back tears. That, more than any conviction or ceremony, felt like justice. A promise kept, a memory honored. Later that night, as Rachel watched Trooper doze, she let herself think about the cost. Trooper had given everything, his strength, his senses, even his aging body, to help her carry the weight of the case. She remembered their first day together, the brash young rookie and the eager K-9, both looking for purpose. They'd found it in each other. Now, with the case closed and Trooper slowing down more each day, Rachel wondered what came next. A ceremony was held at the precinct, a small, quiet affair, nothing like the medals and press conferences of years past. Trooper was given a new collar, shiny and inscribed with hero. Rachel stood at the podium, hands shaking, and spoke not about justice or closure, but about loyalty and presence. She talked about the silent partnership that saved her life more times than she could count, about the comfort of having someone by your side who never judged, never left, never gave up. Her words hung in the air long after the applause faded. She realized that healing was not about forgetting pain, but about allowing it to shape you, to make you more compassionate, more understanding, more human. Persistence and intuition, she told them, were as vital as logic. And the bonds we form, with partners, with friends, even with animals, are what keep us moving forward when the world feels impossible. After the ceremony, Rachel walked Trooper through Riverfront Park. The air was cool, the trees blazing with autumn color, the river running fast and bright. She let herself breathe, really breathe, for the first time in years. She looked around and saw the city differently. The people she passed nodded, some recognizing her, some not. But there was a shift, a quiet gratitude, a sense that justice, however delayed, could still arrive. Back at home, Rachel stretched out on the couch, Trooper at her feet. She thought about everything the case had changed. The department was already rewriting protocols for missing persons. Officers who'd struggled with burnout were getting more support. There was a new respect for K-9 teams, and a renewed sense of community purpose. Rachel knew that closure wasn't an endpoint. It was a beginning. She thought about April, about the courage it took for a scared teenager to ask for help, and the cost of not listening. She thought about Trooper, who had taught her more about trust and resilience than any person ever could. She fell asleep that night with the windows open, the cool air washing away the last of the old ghosts. She dreamed of April's laughter, of Trooper running young and strong, and of a world where remembering mattered as much as solving. When she woke, the world felt lighter. She didn't have all the answers, but she understood now that the real lesson was not in the solving, but in the refusing to forget, in carrying the story forward, and being present for those who remain. Rachel looked at Trooper, his breathing slow and even. She smiled, knowing their journey had changed her forever, and that, perhaps, the deepest kind of justice was in the living. The weeks after Tyrell's confession blurred together in a haze of paperwork, phone calls, and well-meaning visits from colleagues and neighbors. Spokane was quieter now, less tense, less haunted. There were still crimes and tragedies, but the weight of April Henry's disappearance, and all the fear and anger it had left behind, had finally begun to lift. Rachel felt it most in the small moments. The way people at the coffee shop lingered over their greetings, or the soft gratitude in the eyes of April's mother when their paths crossed at the market. There was no parade, no grand gesture. Healing was slow, quiet, a matter of everyday acts and memories honored rather than erased. But as the city moved on, Rachel found herself pausing more often, looking back. For so long, her life had been shaped by this one case, by guilt, determination, and the silent companionship of a dog who never let her give up. Now, with the case closed and justice as complete as it would ever be, she found herself drifting, unmoored. Trooper was slowing down. It happened gradually, almost imperceptibly, like the shift from summer to fall. He slept longer in the sun, sometimes groaning when he stood. His walks grew shorter, and Rachel found herself carrying him up the porch steps more often than not. She watched for signs of pain, for that moment she feared most, when his brave heart would finally give out. She took him everywhere. The riverbank at dawn, where the mist curled over the water, the old oak tree in her backyard, where he'd once dug holes as a young wild pup, the precinct, where he was greeted like a king by old friends and new recruits. She sat with him under the golden autumn sunlight, rubbing his ears, telling him stories only they shared. One late afternoon, when the light was soft and gold, Rachel carried Trooper to their favorite spot beneath the oak. She spread a blanket, sat beside him, and watched as he rested his head in her lap, breathing slow and easy. The world felt impossibly gentle for a moment. Birds singing, wind rustling through dry leaves, the city humming quietly in the distance. Rachel stroked Trooper's fur, tears stinging her eyes. She realized then that the greatest pain wasn't in losing a case or failing to find justice. The truest grief was in saying goodbye to the ones who made life bearable, who taught her how to trust, how to fight, how to love without conditions. Trooper had been more than a partner. He was her teacher, her confidant, her family. She whispered her gratitude to him, voice trembling. "You saved me, old friend. Every single day, you showed me what it meant to keep going, even when it hurt, even when hope felt impossible." Trooper's tail thumped softly, a silent thank you. That night, Rachel woke to find Trooper sleeping deeply, his breath gentle, his body peaceful at last. She sat with him until sunrise, holding his paw, letting herself feel the fullness of her grief and the quiet, powerful love that filled every memory. Trooper's memorial was simple, attended by officers, neighbors, and a few townspeople who knew just how much one dog could mean. Rachel spoke at the small gathering, her words raw but steady. She didn't talk about justice or crime. She talked about empathy, about showing up for those who hurt, about listening when it's hardest, about the silent heroism of every loyal friend. "Trooper taught me," she said, "that being present for someone, even when you can't fix what's broken, is the most important thing of all." As she finished, she looked out at the crowd and saw April's mother standing in the back, hand pressed to her heart, tears glinting in her eyes. There was no need for words, just a nod, a promise carried forward. The community seemed to shift after that. The department launched a new initiative for missing persons, emphasizing compassion and persistence. K-9 officers received better resources and recognition. Young recruits sought Rachel out for advice, eager to learn from the legend of Trooper and the case that changed everything. Rachel found healing in small steps. She volunteered at the local shelter, helped train a new generation of K-9 teams, and took long walks through the park, sometimes alone, sometimes with a borrowed pup. The grief remained, but it softened, woven into the fabric of her days rather than tearing them apart. One quiet Saturday morning, Rachel returned to the shelter and met a young German shepherd, gangly, eager, with a wild streak that reminded her of Trooper's early days. She hesitated, then knelt down, letting the puppy nuzzle her hand. He looked up at her, eyes bright with the same curiosity and loyalty she thought she might never see again. She smiled, a true, unguarded smile. "What do you think, kid? Ready for a new adventure?" She adopted him that afternoon, naming him Chance. As they left the shelter together, Rachel felt the circle closing and opening all at once. A legacy not just of loyalty, but of hope, courage, and the willingness to begin again. That evening, she sat on her porch. Chance sprawled across her lap, the sun sinking low. She thought of April, of Trooper, of all the stories that had shaped her. She understood now that life's greatest pain wasn't something to escape, but something to carry, together with others, with compassion. Rachel's journey was no longer about chasing ghosts or proving herself. It was about presence, resilience, and the promise that she would never turn away from those in need. Whether a lost child, a grieving parent, or an old dog whose faith had never wavered. She looked out over the city and whispered, "Thank you, Trooper, for everything." And with the wind carrying her words into the evening, Rachel found herself ready, at last, for whatever new story tomorrow would bring.